Welcome to Whiteboard Friday. This weekend, of course, we see the decider of the Bledisloe Cup. Yeah! New Zealand versus Australia, locked in a battle for supremacy on the rugby field. Eden Park, all will be decided. And of course, being a World Cup year, it's extra important. Yeah! But this is not the only place where Australia and New Zealand are competing head-to-head this week. The other place we're competing is who is contributing the most to climate change. Yeah! Wait, we probably shouldn't be celebrating that. But nevertheless, it's very close. So let's see who comes out on top or on bottom. I'm not sure which it is. But who is contributing the most to climate change out of New Zealand and Australia? Well, this week, Australia released its 2030 targets for climate change. Of course, all ours are already public. And we can compare those to the 2020 target, and we can compare it to all the other developed economies to see who comes out on top. And believe me, New Zealand and Australia are near the top on all of these metrics. A little bit scary. So, least ambition versus 2020. Our 2020 targets were already out there. How much more have we added on to those 2020 targets in terms of setting up our reductions targets for 2030? And here we can see that actually New Zealand is the least ambitious country around in the developed world in terms of the ambition of our 2030 targets compared to 2020. Australia is a bit down the list, so we actually come out on top on that metric. Next up, emissions per person. So this is the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents, the amount of greenhouse gases that we're pumping into the atmosphere per person. Of course, Australia chugs out more because they have a lot more people, but New Zealand, we have a smaller population. But if we take those populations into account, who comes up on top? Well, Australia is back in the running on this one. They have higher emissions per person. And New Zealand, a lowly third in the developed world in terms of emissions per person. Next up, emissions per dollar. Okay, so this is another quite important metric. How much greenhouse gases do we chug out per dollar of GDP that we create? Again, Australia, with all the coal that they burn, comes out number one. And New Zealand, again, third in the developed world on this metric. No big surprise here with all the coal. And we're so high because of our agriculture, which, as we've said before, perhaps shouldn't be counted in quite the same way. So we're definitely not as bad as Australia on that metric. Reductions targets since 1990. Well, how big an effort are we making? All depends on when we start measuring what is our baseline year for when we start to make reductions from. Of course, most countries in the world use 1990 because that was the agreement as part of the Kyoto Protocol. And New Zealand, on this metric, actually beats Australia. We are second in the OECD, Australia third. So actually top there is Canada. Blame Canada, which actually is aiming for a target in 2030 which is higher than their emissions in 1990. Boo Canada. But New Zealand, with its 11% reduction, is not far behind. We are second. So we pip Australia on that one, and we're back in the running. It's level pegging right down to the wire. Who's going to win? Yeah. Let's look at reductions since 2005. So, of course, to try and make ourselves look better, we've chosen a later year as our baseline for reductions targets. So 2030 versus 2005. And actually, on this measure, New Zealand is around about average in the OECD. That's because a lot of other countries started in the 90s and early 2000s to reduce their emissions, but we kept on increasing ours. So if we use 2005 as our baseline year, we actually look pretty good. Australia versus 2005 are actually the third worst out of the developed countries. So the worst one there is actually Norway. But not really boo Norway, because they actually did quite a lot of reductions between 1990 and 2005. So they haven't got that many more emissions to reduce. So Australia overall is the winner of the Bledisloe Cup of who's contributing the most to climate change by a close margin. Sometimes it's good to know Aussies out there making us look good.